Great. Well, welcome everyone, and thank you for attending our conversation today on Editors Confidential. We are very fortunate to have the editors-in-chiefs of 4 peer-reviewed journals from the social sciences. And what we'll do today is each of the editors will share their wise tips on everything from how to choose a journal, how to write a manuscript that will make it through the review process successfully, and then really importantly, share insights that editors know about how do they make decisions about revisions, rejections, conditional acceptances, choosing reviewers, kind of all the mystery of what happens in the peer review journal process. So what we will do is I'll first just name each of the editors, and they can say a little bit about kind of their journal, what the topic is, the kind of work that's done. And so you'll have a sense of the journals that are represented here today. And then we will go through some questions that I've posed for the panelists. Folks will chime in when and share their views. And then we're hoping we have plenty of time for Q&A. And so please do not be shy if you have questions that arise during the session. Please put them in the chat. And then at the end, if you raise your hand, we can have a conversation. So welcome all, and thank you for taking time to join us today. I have not introduced myself yet, but hi, everyone. I'm Debbie Carr. I'm a sociology professor and director of the Center for Innovation in Social Science. And I've edited a few journals, but currently I edit Journal of Health and Social Behavior, which is a medical sociology journal. And I'll try to kind of stay in the background today and give the floor to our wonderful panelists. So in alphabetical order, we first have Elizabeth Cohen, who is new to Boston University, who's representing the journal, American Journal of Political Science. So Elizabeth, if you'd like to say a couple of words about yourself and your journal.
Sure, thanks so much. So for people who aren't political scientists, American Journal of Political Science is kind of one of our big 3 journals. The other 2 are American Political Science Review and Journal of Politics, depending on how you measure. We're either number 1 or number 2. So it's a highly selective, highly competitive process where we have well under a 10% acceptance rate. And we work as a team. So I edit for political theory, and I'm happy to answer questions about that subfield or very general questions about our process, and specific questions about the other subfields. If anybody has them, I will direct you to those field editors.
Great, thank you. So next we have Austin Fracht, who's editor-in-chief of Health Services Research.
Yeah, hi. Health services research has a scope of the financing, organization, and delivery and outcomes of healthcare, which sounds very broad, but we are not a clinical journal. We are about, as I kind of said, the organization, delivery, financing, but not about clinical interventions. The scope is also narrowed by the fact that we are focused on the US health system, and we expect papers to speak to US policy or practice, with the exception of methods papers. So we also accept or consider papers that are about methods, new methods applied to the field. And our acceptance rate is about 13% out of about 1,000 submissions per year. However, a great deal of the rejections, specifically desk rejections, are because we get papers from overseas that are focused on countries that are not the US, because authors, I guess, did not read the author instructions. So if you exclude all those, the acceptance rate is closer to something like 20%. So if you're focused on the US health system, you have a little better chance. One other thing I'll point out is our time to first decision is about 2 months, unless it's a desk reject, in which case it's a few weeks. But if it's a revision or even a rejection with reviewers, it takes about 2 months on average.
Great, thank you. And these terms are things that we're going to be digging into a little bit more as we go through our session today. But for folks who just popped in or who might be new to the publishing process, if a paper gets rejected, there are two pathways. The desk reject is when the editor looks at the paper fairly quickly and decides the paper, for a range of reasons, does not need to go out for review. It's rejected before review, either on the basis of fit or quality, and you'll hear more about that. That's very different than having the paper sent out to reviewers, and then the reviewers come back with recommendations that ultimately lead to a rejection. And so we'll be hearing more about that later. And so that's just clarifying a couple of terms that Austin used that we all talk about, but might be new, especially for those of you who are starting your careers. So next up, alphabetically, we have Alya Guseva, who represents Socioeconomic Review.
Hi, I'm Alya Guseva. I'm a sociologist here at VU, and I'm one of the two chief editors of Socioeconomic Review. It's a very young journal. It's just recently celebrated its 20th anniversary. It's published by by Oxford University Press, but it's a journal of the Society for Advancement of Socioeconomics. So it's a both international and interdisciplinary journal. We publish political economy, so there's political scientists who publish in the journal, economic sociology like myself, and also heterodox economics. It's a pretty good journal. It's I think ranked maybe last year in the top 10, I think, in sociology. The acceptance rate is a little under 10%. It varies from year to year, maybe 10 to 12, maybe 10 to 8. We get about, I think last year we got 500 manuscripts, but this year we're already getting 500 something. So we're probably on track to get something like 700 manuscripts a year. And there's a team of editors, so 2 chief editors and 6 more editors. And because it's an interdisciplinary journal, we have at least, I think we have 2 economists. We have maybe a couple of political scientists. We have a couple of sociologists that are managing different types of papers that are coming in. I think in Socioeconomic Review in particular, we're looking for papers that are empirically based. Typically, we published a very small number of theory papers. There's a special category of papers we publish, which are called state of the art. Most of our papers are empirically based, but they also push the envelope further than just reporting the results of an empirical analysis by kind of making what we call theoretical contributions. So that's probably where I will stop.
Great, thank you. And then our final editor today is Kevin Lang, who's editor-in-chief of the Journal of Labor Economics.
And as you might guess, I'm an economist, a labor economist. Yes, I'm editor-in-chief for another 13 days, 8 hours, and I think about 19 minutes. Not that I'm counting. I work with 9 editors to whom I assign papers that get submitted. I personally reject about 45% of the papers that come in. They probably among them reject somewhere in the order of 5 to 10% of the papers. So our desk reject rate is probably in the range of 50 to 60%. Our acceptance rate is about 7%. So it's, like all of these journals, it's a struggle to get in.
Great, thank you. And that's a perfect transition to our first question. And so I'll pose a question and then a different person will kick off the answers, and then others can chime in and we'll kind of go through alphabetically. And the first question I ask, coming from my perspective, that every paper has a home, right? Even though some of the journals we represent have very high rejection rates, there are many, many journals out there where scholars can send their work. And so how do people choose a journal? What are some guidelines for choosing an appropriate journal to send your manuscript to? And then thinking about, again, maybe your first choice, second choice, and how that unfolds. So we'll start that question to Elizabeth, and other folks can add on and chime in.
Thanks much. So I'm just going to mention that it looks from the faces and pictures and avatars, I can see like there are a lot of early career researchers on the Zoom. And so I'm going to maybe target my advice in that direction a little bit. And if you're not in that crew, please don't take offense and please speak up. But a really good rule of thumb, first of all, is to choose your journal fairly early in the process of writing your piece. And this turns out to be harder than one would imagine. So I often find I'm like, I really want to put off that decision because I'm very interested in the work I'm doing. But when I'm on the other side of the desk and I'm receiving pieces, it's often really clear that the person who sent something in either did or did not spend some time reading and thinking about AJPS. So one way that I can tell whether they really, just want a high status publication or whether they were thinking about the type of work that we publish in AJPS is whether they've cited anything from the journal or from journals very similar. We're a generalist journal, and so work that's really, really subfield specific is not going to sound like it belongs in the journal, and it's not going to be engaged in any kind of dialogue with other work that's been published in the journal or work that one might find in a similar type of generalist journal. So I think you really have to read the journals and be very honest with yourselves about like what the scope of the work that you're doing is and who you're speaking to. Pick the journal early before you've locked in your piece, so that you can really, again, keep that journal in mind as you're working rather than having to retrofit your piece after the fact.
Great, thank you. Very helpful. Austin, do you have things to add or expand?
Yes, I think you should be talking to your co-authors and colleagues who are familiar with the work that you're doing. And you can always ask, when you're sort of getting ready to write the paper, or even as it's being written, where does it seem like this should go? And you'll get probably a variety of answers, and you can just collect those. You could also ask that question when you present at a conference, maybe not to the whole audience, but like if you have a discussion with someone after and they're particularly interested, you might say, oh, by the way, where could you see something like this being published? And you'll get ideas. And so you'll get a list. And within that list, you should then, of course, consider prestige and impact, which are relatively standard things to consider, but also look carefully at the journal's focus and make sure your area matches the focus, that your type of analyses matches what's in the journal. You'll want to look through articles in the journal that are in some sense similar to yours, whether it's the data or the focus area, but also see if the kind of analyses, sort of the level of sophistication or the sort of the norms of that journal fit with what you're doing. And you'll want to match style, length, and so forth. And some of that is conveyed in the author instructions, but some of it is just kind of norms that you'll pick up by reading other articles in the journal.
Great, thank you. Alia.
I mean, generally speaking, I think when you're looking for a journal, you have to make a decision, and that's probably at the stage where you're still writing a paper, framing it, whether you want to publish it in a specialist journal or generalist journal, because depending on that, how you answer this question, you will probably pitch it differently. You will be much more, your audience will be different. And like in sociology, you will be much speaking or asking much broader questions that would be of interest to general audience, as opposed to kind of more specific questions where you don't have to explain as many sort of assumptions or specific literature or definitions behind certain concepts. So that's a very general kind of question. Then I think you can look at different journals and look, for example, something was mentioned before, is there time to decision? That's an important metric. Not all journals report it, many journals do report it. And what you want is something that is within reasonable margins. I would say in sociology, something within reasonable margins, if it's reported, is around 3 months. If it's less, great. Last year, somehow in SER, we were able to come up with 69 days on a first time to decision. I'm not fully sort of trusting that stats, because it was much lower from like 96 days the year before, but even 96 days is within 3 months. So that's something you want to see. Obviously, you want to kind of consider the trade-off between how selective the journal is and what the risk is. So the more selective the journal is, meaning the lower the acceptance rate, the higher risk is that it's not going to be accepted, and sometimes even after review. So there's this time sort of lost. The most selective journals in sociology, for example, are extremely difficult to publish in. And if you do end up publishing AJS, ASR, it may take that 2 years to actually get the manuscript through. And so decisions like this have to be made in the context of your specific situation. You know, do you need to graduate? Do you need to look for a job? So you need to kind of make these decisions about how long it may take me to publish there, or what the risk is. And whether I'm willing to take this risk if I have time, given where you are in your career. Specifically with respect to SCR, I think Austin, gave the advice I was going to give, which is before you submit to a journal, it's a very good idea to actually look for articles that are similar to yours in any way, because if you don't find anything, chances are it's not a good journal for you. There are some instances when you want to write something like really programmatic and that pushes the journal's kind of scope a little further. We like that, but I think most articles that we see are not like that. They simply are just a bad fit for us. And it's very clear, the vast majority of desk-rejected articles are just not a good fit in the sense that they really don't speak our language. They don't engage in the debates, a dialogue that sort of we published. And it's very clear that the authors haven't looked at the journal, haven't read the journal, just kind of went down the list. Yeah, I think that's what I would say.
Great, thank you. Kevin.
Yeah, so I think I'm going to repeat slightly differently most of some of the things that have already been said. And the first thing clearly is to know what the journal is about. Right? So I get papers about the effect of the minimum wage on housing prices. Well, that's a paper in housing, not a paper in labor economics. So make sure you really understand, not just read the title of the journal. So fit's important. Take a slightly different stand on similar, or maybe expand on what we mean similar to what's been published. One of the things I sometimes get is, well, last year you published an analysis of this policy in Chile. I've now analyzed this policy in Brazil, and obviously this is a good fit, as opposed to, well, maybe we've already looked at this policy and this is not as much of an advance any longer if you're getting the same results. Overall, clearly try to be objective as much as you can about the quality of your paper, right? Is it really a transformative paper that's going to get into one of the most selective journals in the field? And what's your objective? What do you are you going on the market, and would you like to have a revise and resubmit on your CV when you apply for a job? Well, that means going to a less prestigious journal. If you're going up for tenure and you've got 6 or 7 years to go before you're going up for tenure, make sure you talk to your mentors and your senior faculty about what they'll be looking for when you go up for tenure. Do you need, in politics, AJS, APSR, Journal of Politics, or will they be happy with, a good number of articles just below that level? So you need to know your timetable, your objective. It's basically an optimal search problem where you're trading off probability of acceptance against the value of acceptance.
Thank you. Spoken like an economist. Yeah, I would add just one or two other little things. One is kind of thinking about the audience that you want to communicate to, or the community that you're hoping to be a part of, right? You might have a favorite journal. You might want to speak to a more applied audience in some cases, as opposed to a more theoretical audience. So really thinking about where you want to have your work kind of sit. The other is just kind of a little question, but sometimes you have a paper that spans 2 areas, right? Especially those who are quantitative. Like I study the impacts of families on health. Should I send it to a family journal or a health journal, right? And so a lot of you might be sitting at that space. And my recommendation is go to the topical journal if you're interested in a topical journal that you draw your theoretical perspectives from, right? Because that's going to be what the editors almost always look for, is not only the empirical findings being important, but there should be some foothold in some theory. So that's kind of one other little tip I would add. But that leads to our next question. So our next question, Austin will kick off the conversation. So then each of the editors will go around and say, what to you are the 2 to 3 main characteristics of a successful manuscript? And by success, we mean one that will reasonably get an opportunity for a revise and resubmit and then publication.
Yes. So I'm going to say a mix of things that are probably specific to my journal, health services research, and things that are more general. So for health services research, we look for articles that speak to policy and practice. That's right in our mission. The article, unless it's a methods article, which I mentioned earlier. So that's going to be necessary. And we're looking for, novel research questions, which is generally true, with well-defined, well-defended and explained methods. So those are, I think, fairly obvious, or you'll hear that a lot. I think overlooked, but incredibly important, is that your article minimizes cognitive burden on the reader. This is basically advice on how to get through the review process. So that, what do I mean by minimizes cognitive burden? I mean, makes your subject or your topic in your paper, try to make it relatively easy to read. This is widely overlooked. Papers are generally very difficult to read, and it makes reviewers grumpy, and grumpy reviewer is more likely to reject your paper. I have a hypothesis that reviewers basically make a decision quite early in reading a paper whether they're going to reject it or not. They don't know they've made a decision, perhaps, but it's implicit. And then they look for reasons to reject it. So if you keep the reader happy by writing a paper that's kind of easy to read, I don't mean simplistic, I mean easy to follow, you're not going to irritate your reviewer. And I'll close with saying you should ensure that your paper is stylistically similar to others in the journal you're submitting to. That sounds kind of trivial. What does style have to do with substance? Well, they are separable, but the reviewers are expecting a certain style. And when you write in a different style than they are expecting, they are going to be grumpy. And when they're grumpy, they're likely to reject your paper.
Great advice. Very, very important. Don't make the reader work too hard to understand. Great advice. So next up, alphabetically, sorry, we're all shifted. Alia.
Well, I think it's difficult to add to what Austin just said. I think it's absolutely, I mean, I have to second this point that the papers need to be written with a structure that is expected and familiar to, which I think, so the structure that's expected and familiar to us as editors and also to reviewers is typically the structure that is taught, I think, is not in North American graduate schools. So even some European countries have different sort of styles of writing, where an article can be sort of written as a mystery novel where the punchline is the end. You don't really know where the findings are until and who has the patience to do that. So there's certain kind of expectation. And we actually at SCR, given that we're an international journal, we are consciously trying to live up to this notion. And we actually hold workshops for young scholars, and just the recent one we held was in Rio in conjunction with our annual conference. And a lot of the people that were there, people from the Global South, just kind of giving them some of the basics about the structure of the paper, but also specifics about the journal. So the specifics is that we're looking always for theoretical contributions. So you may have sound empirical research, but there's no theoretical contribution that's significant or somewhat novel. I think it will be very, very difficult to sell the paper. There's obviously has to be a clear research question that's sort of going back to how important it is to structure a paper in a way that the reader, whether it's an editor or a reviewer, knows exactly what your research question is, and to have your data and methods kind of match the research question. And I think in our case, we also are all for sort of the clarity and accessibility of the manuscripts, because we are in interdisciplinary journal. So our papers really need to be free of jargon that may be specific to a particular discipline or to a particular subdiscipline, because then it would become, if it's very jargony, it becomes sort of unreadable and impenetrable for specific editor or for the reviewers. And so from the standpoint of your audience, in our case at least, because we are an interdisciplinary journal, we think of ourselves as a generalist journal, despite the fact that we are focused on social economy. So we want sort of the conversation and the language to be accessible to people from many countries and from a variety of disciplines.
Great, thank you. Next, Kevin, 2 to 3 characteristics of a successful publishable manuscript.
Well, aside from obviously being brilliant and path-breaking, the thing I thought I was going to be the one person to talk about was quality of writing. Apparently, we all agree about that. I've known editors who will desk reject on the basis of the abstract. And I don't mean just because it's not a good fit, but they just read it and they say, well, there's nothing interesting in there. I don't do that. But I would say, if you write a really good introduction, you can get out to the reviewers without me looking at the rest of the paper, right? If you write a bad introduction, I'm certainly going to look at the rest of the paper before I decide not to desk reject it. And at that point, there's a much better chance that I'll find something that I don't like. So getting to the point, don't waste my time. Tell me what you did. Tell me what your contribution is. Tell me why it's important, and do that early on. And if you do that effectively, you've got a much better chance of getting past me. You still have to write the rest of the paper well, but spend a lot of time on that introduction, and don't fall into the trap of spending your first 2 pages situating it in the literature, talking all about stuff that is peripheral to what you're actually achieving in the paper.
Great, thank you. Elizabeth, your tips for main characteristics of a successful manuscript.
Thanks. I didn't get to sneak this in, so I just want to give one really practical tip for the previous question, which was when you're choosing a journal, do look at the editorial board on the website and make sure that those are your people. I should have added it in and I forgot. Apologies for getting us out of order. But on the subject of successful or publishable manuscript, I think it's really important that you be in conversation with other people who've written on a topic that will be of interest to the readership of the journal. I know, like, the feeling of thinking something so original that it can't be placed in conversation, but actually it turns out nothing we're doing is completely out of the blue. So make it clear where you fit in, because that will show kind of who you think your peers are in the argument. Make it lean. So as they say, kill your darlings, like save it for the book or save it for another article. But if it's a digression, you're going to lose it eventually, and better to not get rejected because you're meandering. And similarly, keep the structure of the piece really tight. Let people know upfront what the structure is going to be, and then follow it, signposting along the way. And then I think the last thing I'd say, besides just generally writing well, is people have lots of different opinions on in other contexts for using first person, second person, third person. I really think it's a good idea to try and use third person as much as possible, and to avoid kind of casual conversational language. I see a surprising amount of that. It's tempting to do it. I sometimes want to do it as well, but it doesn't sound good on the other side of the desk. I just think it tends to set editors and reviewers' teeth on edge. So I would be risk averse when it comes to that, and just use third person as much as possible.
Great, thank you. Great advice. And Alias, your hand is up. You have something to add.
So just something to add. I just want to second what Kevin said and offer a little anecdote. So Academy of Management Journal, which is a top journal in management, several years ago did a series of this really educational editorials for future article submitters from management or from organizational sociology of studies. And one of these editorials was actually based on the editors interviewing the winners of the Academy of Management Journal Prize for the best article. And they've asked them how many times they revised their introduction. And the answer was 10. And they also asked them how much time they spend on writing introduction versus other parts of the paper. And it was like a very skewed kind of report that the introduction is actually very important. Well, for the winners of the prize, but certainly to get the attention of the editor at the very first read.
Great. Thank you. I think that's important to convey, that even for people who publish a lot, it looks like they just whip out these papers magically, but every sentence is labored over, often at great length, as that anecdote shows.
Can I add one thing?
Please.
I'm noticing that we're saying things that may be difficult to implement, like, write well. We don't have time to teach you how to write well. It's in this webinar. Nor would we have time to teach how to write well probably in a whole semester. It actually takes years and years and a lifetime to write well. So partnering with people who you think write well would be a good idea. Hopefully your co-authors are good writers. In addition, I wouldn't say instead, but in addition, finding papers that you think are well written or that others tell you are well written, and then reading them carefully and modeling what you do after them, or at least recognizing that you're not reaching that level and then asking for help of someone who maybe can help you. So writing well is extremely hard. It is not a science, it is an art. There are tricks. You can turn some of it into a science, but at the end of the day, it's about hearing and you have to hear how the words sound. I'll stop there. I could go on because good writing is very important to me, but it is hard to implement. I want to just recognize that.
Yeah, absolutely. Great advice. I would add just one or two little things about kind of quality matters, right? The writing has to be impeccable, but the science or scholarship also has to be impeccable. And so the method needs to be really well done for whatever method it is that you use. If you're a quantitative data analyst, don't present a paper based on one wave of a longitudinal study, right? If you're making causal arguments, unless you model properly. If you're doing ethnography, make sure that the number of interviews you have is kind of consistent with industry standards. Because some papers do have not a fatal methodological flaw, but a death-inducing flaw. And be clear about your method, right? I have a kind of a boilerplate I put in my decision letters that the method section need to be sufficiently detailed so that someone could replicate your study if they chose to do so. You don't need every single detail, but you do need people to know how exactly you assembled your sample, analyze your data, so they know whether or not to kind of believe the results. So I would just kind of lean on method a little more. And then just perfect cohesion, that if you're setting up 3 hypotheses or 3 literatures, make sure you present your results in that order. Think about kind of an invisible thread that holds together kind of background, methods, results. Because if some new analysis appears on page 18 and hits the readers out of the blue, again, it speaks to that issue of writing and cohesiveness. So I would just kind of lean a little bit on some of those methodological issues. Yeah, really great advice from our panelists of writing well. So people have chosen their journals, right? They've sent their paper out. And as folks newer to the publishing processes may or may not know, when you send your paper out, a couple of things can happen. It can be just reject, right? That means it didn't really fit. And so they'll say, sorry, please take your paper elsewhere. In most cases, it goes out to review, either somewhere between 2 to 4 reviewers. And then you get a decision letter. And that decision can either be a major revise and resubmit, which is the most common thing to get other than a rejection with review, or a minor revision, or a reject with review. But in any of those buckets, what you get back are really detailed reviews from the reviewers and an editor synthesis letter kind of telling you what you need to do to successfully revise your paper for this journal, if it's an R&R, or things to do if you're rejected to make your paper better for somewhere else. So for many of you, after you send your paper off, your next task is to do an effective revision, right? You do all the things the reviewers have asked you to do, and then you send it back. And this is something very common. And so now I'd like each of the panelists to weigh in on how do you do an effective revision, right? These things are hard. And so we'll start with Alia, then we'll go back through the alphabet. What do you do when you're lucky enough to get that R&R decision?
So I think the first thing, I think a lot of times when people get an R&R, they read the reviews and they have an immediate emotional reaction to them because some of the reviewers come across as callous sometimes completely misunderstanding the argument. And I think, unfortunately, the critical reviews or the critical parts of the reviews kind of drown out the fact that you got an R&R, which is a better of the two options. The other could have been a rejection. I think the advice sometimes people give is just to step away from this for maybe a week or so, just kind of calm down. Sometimes authors I've heard want to jump in immediately, but it really depends on how you kind of respond emotionally. I think in the best case scenario, the decision letter has kind of a detailed guidelines from your editor on how to handle the reviews. Now, that doesn't always happen. Sometimes the comments are actually quite skimpy, basically saying that the reviews are below, we decided to give you an R&R, so this is it. But I think even in that case, you have to read and sort of figure out, and sometimes editors are straightforward as to to what extent this is a kind of a straightforward or not so straightforward revision. At SCR, we don't have a major revision or minor revision. We just have an R&R. But sometimes some editors would call some R&Rs high-risk R&Rs, or sometimes, in very rare cases, there's even such thing as reject and resubmit, meaning that the paper is rejected, but it's invited to be resubmitted, which almost never happens, but in some cases it does. So you need to read and understand whether editor is providing any help to you. And then you need to read reviews. Now, from the standpoint of how to actually do it, is you have to be, the most important thing is actually, I think what I found looking at some unsuccessful revisions is that you have to provide very detailed response to every single comment that was given by each reviewer point by point. In a couple of cases where papers ended up being rejected despite reviews, I think the reviewers really felt that their comments were ignored or kind of overlooked because the letter did not provide, at the very least, a very detailed response to those comments. So generally speaking, you have to be polite. You have to, you should thank probably reviewers for their comments, but you shouldn't thank them for every single comment. Some of them can be, but you have to be, in responding to reviewers' comments, you have to be making sure that you're responding to each comment sort of directly. Unfortunately, what that leads to oftentimes is that the response to reviewer's letter, which you submit with the resubmission, sometimes is longer than the paper itself. Because what the authors do sometimes, they just cut and paste from the review and then kind of give their responses underneath. That doesn't always work because you have to be substantively kind of like convincing and compelling. One other thing I've learned is that it's more important to convince the editor in the end than the reviewers, because editors have discretion and papers can be accepted even if a reviewer recommends a rejection, for example, in the second round. So if the editor provides any guidelines, and particularly if these guidelines are kind of developed or there's details, you really have to address those and make sure that you are following those guidelines. There's this question, of course, well, in the end, it's your paper. What should you do, with the comments that you do not necessarily want to implement? My position is that it's your paper and you don't have to do everything that the reviewers tell you to do. Hopefully you would not have that reaction to what the editor told you, but you can certainly politely explain why making certain changes is not something that makes sense in the context of your paper.
Great.
But don't get defensive. I mean, I think you have to, the tone of this response should be positive, upbeat, thankful, and kind of constructive.
Great, thank you. And just one little information point that folks might not know, I think this might be different for economists, but for the rest of us, we're not paid to do peer reviews. So we donate many, many hours every week reading the papers of a stranger and writing up 3 pages. And so I think entering the review process, recognizing that people are doing this kind of out of the goodness of their own heart to make your paper better, might help to kind of cushion the blow of some of those nasty comments that sometimes appear, but just as a point of information. But now, Kevin, more on what your journal makes for an effective revision.
And I would say in most of our journals, we're not paid either.
Okay.
So just one response before I go back to this question, which is in economics, I would say I is perfectly acceptable. And I would actually say it's preferable to either using the passive voice or this paper does such and such. The paper shouldn't be about you. So to prove this, divide by, not I divide by, but if it's I begin with this, that's fine. Yeah, so I have to agree. My response is that every referee who doesn't like my paper is a blithering idiot, and those who really like it are deeply insightful. And after about a week, I can actually read the reports and figure out that some of the comments are really quite good. So what should you do? And I think there are different situations, right? If you've been rejected, I would say there's a lot of very idiosyncratic responses to your paper. If you see a pattern, you should follow that up and revising your paper for the next place. If everybody says the same thing, they're probably right, not always, but they probably are. If you think they're right, then obviously correct, make the change. Reject and resubmits are unfortunately more common in my field. I would not call them uncommon. But if whether you get a reject and resubmit or a regular revise and resubmit, I'd say the pattern is the same. And I'm mostly going to be repeating things, but you have to look at each comment. In general, you should do your best to address the question, make the modification. It may be, bad writing on your part, and you can fix it, or it may be you have to change what you do. And sometimes the suggestion will not be a good one. I've seen cases where referees were simply wrong about the statistics, and you had to respond by saying no, and here's the reference, and they're wrong. But whatever you do in saying that, be extremely polite, not obsequious. It does not have to be, you wrote the somewhere when you should have only written the. You don't have to respond to that by saying that was a very good point. Thank you for pointing it out. Done or correct, fixed or whatever is perfectly fine. But my rule is in dealing with editors and referees, editors are gods, referees are demigods, and you anger the gods at your own peril. So you better have a good reason for not doing what they tell you to do.
Great, thank you. Elizabeth, your thoughts on tips for an effective revision?
So this is all helpful advice that you've heard, and I just will say things do vary by discipline. So for example, this is the first I'm hearing of reject and resubmit. We categorically do not do it at our journal, and I haven't experienced it in my career, so I'm learning along with everyone else. I think a really important part of the process that's kind of come up indirectly is writing a good letter. And so it came up that they can get very long. I think that's probably not a good idea because everybody all the reviewers are going to want to see how important they were when they read it and what kind of attention you paid. Same goes for the editor. So you're going to have to find a way to get to everything, even if you say, I couldn't follow up on this because, and then insert a good reason. No, you can't look like you ignored anything, but you have to do it relatively efficiently to not lose your audience. And I also think involved in that process is some strategic characterization of the feedback you got. So, you know, you have a little bit of leeway to kind of reframe things that you were told in a way that might signal to the editor that that you like the strategy you're using is the appropriate strategy for the critique. It takes a little bit of the power away from a reviewer who maybe is asking you for something that sends the manuscript in a direction you don't think it should go. But for, and where I edit, actually, I wouldn't make a distinction between the importance of the editor and the reviewers. We rarely, if we get a very strong reviewer statement that's like high quality review that's negative, we're rarely going to override it. And that does make some people really angry, but that is how we work. And one thing that hasn't come up is that if this really matters to you, but it's going to take a while or life intervenes, extensions are generally available. I think we're taught to think of time as something that's like, if we ask for it from somebody else, they're giving it up or something. But for us, it really does not matter. And you having the time you need to do the work is so important to you, and you meeting a deadline for me to send something back out for review is so non-important. And I don't even see the requests for extensions. Our managing editor gets them. Like, you are not displeasing anybody. Take the time you need. And lastly, I don't know if this is the right place to insert this, but there are generally, excuse me, there are appeal processes at most journals, and you can we can talk about like how to appeal a decision that hasn't gone your way, but that is also something that you can do once you get a decision from a journal. So I just wanted to mention that.
Great, thank you. And Austin is next. Austin has kindly put in the meeting chat, so you can see there a link to an essay he wrote that summarizes his thoughts for responding to reviewers. If you click on that, you can save it. And then I'll give the mic to Austin.
Well, for that reason, I won't say very much, and also much of what I have there has already been said. So I'll just give one piece of practical advice, which is also at that link, which is when you're ready to process the review a little less emotionally than initially, break it up point by point and start your letter structure of, you know, editor comment 1, or E-1 is the shorthand I use. Editor comment 2, editor comment 3, reviewer 1, comment 2. Break it all up, because that is your roadmap. That is your roadmap for the letter, which you will then write. And then once you've written your letter and your co-authors think it's you've got a good lead on responding to everything, that is then your roadmap for revising the paper. It makes the process so much easier than trying to take it all in kind of in one big thing and then try to revise the manuscript and then go write the letter. I've seen people kind of get in a big mess doing that, and co-authors, because I'm talking to you as if you're the lead author. In other words, this is your responsibility. As a co-author, and when I've seen lead authors get into a big mess and not have a well-organized process for dealing with a review, it's a real big burden on the co-authors to help you untangle it. Don't do that. Just don't do it. And it's a very routine thing. Just break it up point by point and go through it systematically. And you can even in first time through write, I don't know how to respond to this. I need some help from my co-authors. That's totally fine. It gives them a roadmap too. So I'll stop there.
Great, and Alia's hand is up. Oh, did you have something?
Yeah, I just wanted to respond to something Elizabeth say. We also give extensions. It's no problem. Sometimes I get the request and I can put this in the system. Sometimes it's done over my head with the managing editor. The problem, however, is that if you don't get your revision in reasonable amount of time, what may happen is the editors change. So the editor that was overlooking your paper will not be the same. And it would be a very uphill process, I think, to get, it's not given that whoever replaces that editor will necessarily be as excited about your paper as the previous editor was. And I think the same goes for reviewers. You know, if it's been a really long time, and again, we can give you not endless, but a lot of extensions or an extension on a lot of time. The editors may not be as likely to review something that they have very distant memory or no memory, or maybe by the time you submit, they moved on to a different project, and sort of this paper is not particularly in their kind of scope of vision anymore. So my advice, yes, you can ask for extensions, but don't wait. Do it as soon as you can for those reasons.
Great, thank you. And I think a theme coming through here is that there's so much variety across journals, across fields, and how they work. There are some journals out there, they've had one editor for 40 years. For those of us who edit association journals, we turn over every 3 to 5 years. Likewise, the point about the tense and the what verb tense to use, what pronouns to use, or first or third person. And so in the chat, you'll see Austin has another essay on the tense issue, right? And so lots of resources here that are helpful. Okay. And so what we'll do now, then we've been talking about the revision memo. You're writing it both to the editors, but to those reviewers, right? Those 2 to 4 people who will read your paper, spend hours writing up comments for no pay. And how do we choose them, right? There are a lot of different factors that go in, and the fate of a paper can depend on these demigods, right? And these reviewers. And so now we'll go around and our editors will share a little bit about their strategies for choosing reviewers for a particular manuscript. And so we'll lead off with Kevin, then kick back through the alphabet.
Okay, so, I've done enough of these roundtables to know that there's a lot of variation here. In some fields, I understand it's very acceptable to suggest reviewers. In my field, it's not. It's very uncommon to suggest a reviewer. Most of the time when somebody's suggesting a reviewer, they have an email that ends in .ru, and the person is somebody I've never heard of, and probably that even if I have heard of them, it's probably not really their email. It's an attempt to get themselves assigned to be the reviewer. What I do allow is you can ask me not to use a particular reviewer. There are cases where there are personal battles between people, and as long as you're kind of reasonable about it, I don't have a problem with you at least warning me that you think there's a conflict of interest. Beyond that, of course, it depends on how well I know the topic area for your paper. And if I know the topic area well, I probably have a bunch of potential reviewers at my fingertips. Even then, I have to go and look to see when did they last do a review for us. We have a rule that we can't ask somebody to review a paper if a first submission of a paper if they have completed a review that we've asked them to do within the last 9 months. Okay, we don't encourage them to do it late, so the clock starts when they're first asked, not when they provided the review. There will be times when either the people who I naturally want to ask turn out not to be available, or I simply don't know the area that well. And then, the logical place to start is to look at who's in the references. Right? And there, I'm going to look at sort of some combination of, do I recognize the name? Is this somebody who I think of as a good scholar? And how close is the paper that's being cited to what the paper that's being reviewed is. Often, I would say, 20% of the time, when I ask somebody to review a paper, they write back saying, "I'm sorry, I can't review this." But here are some people you might try, and depending on whether I've got a bunch of good backups out there or not, I may either say, oh, gee, that was a great idea. Why didn't I think of that? Or go look at the person's website and their record and say, yes, this looks like somebody who's publishing in good journals, whose opinion I should respect. And there was one more point, which unfortunately has slipped my mind. So let me stop there. Maybe it'll come back.
Thank you. And if it comes back, just raise your cartoon hand and we will get to it. So next, Elizabeth, your strategies for choosing reviewers for a manuscript.
Okay. So we're fairly large, which means when your manuscript comes in, it goes to our managing editor for technical checks. Often it's going to fail a technical check. It's not a big deal. Goes back and forth, and then it gets it goes to staff who work on suggesting reviewers. So I will have a pool of reviewers that one of the people who works for the journal has suggested before I ever get to work. They do things like go through the citations. We also, I don't know what software everyone else is using. We're using Editorial Manager, which you will hate. You will hate it. We all hate it. It's terrible. It's not going anywhere. But in Editorial Manager, there's a large pool of reviewers with tags for area of expertise. So they're also, in addition to looking through the citations, they're going to be looking for people that are tagged. We actually have a formal process of soliciting suggested reviewers, so things really differ. I'm shocked to hear some people are suggesting themselves as reviewers in disguise. That's not possible, really. Our staff is verifying everybody, and so that's not something that would happen. And I want to talk about that process of suggesting reviewers because I think it's really important. And I have a slightly cynical view of academia in this regard, which is that nothing is perfectly, nobody who is really successful is simply successful because of merit. Networks really matter. So you want to think about not who knows your work, because that's a conflict of interest if they've read the paper, but who's friendly to your work. This is your big chance to advocate for your paper. So who's friendly to your work? And I'm going to tell you who's probably not friendly to your work is the most famous person you've ever heard of that works in the area. Those are people who very likely have recently reviewed, have tons of review requests, or in some cases are gigantic prima donnas and couldn't be bothered to do any service for the profession. But it's really common that very junior scholars suggest famous people, the most senior people in their area, and it rarely works out. I think you really want to be shooting for people who are maybe not super junior, but who are kind of mid-career and probably still doing tons of reviewing. And again, who are going to be friendly to your approach. We also have a formal process for soliciting conflicts of interest. So you should be very honest about that, because if somebody outs you as having suggested or not struck a reviewer where there's a conflict of interest, one of the things Editorial Manager allows us to do on the back end is make notes. So, if you refuse review requests also, but if you're acting in an unethical way, either for generations forward, editors will be able to see that in the file. So you should really be very upfront about that. A couple other things. In some journals, the board is very influential. They may be reviewing a lot. Our board members have to review 4 times a year, but they may also be consulted for suggestions for editors. And I personally am looking to get a diverse pool of reviewers. So I really am looking to get people from an array of types of institutions and parts of the world. So, when you're thinking about who you suggest in your pool, you might also remember that some of us care a lot about that.
Great, thank you. Very helpful. Next, Austin. Things to add on reviews.
I don't have a lot of novel things to say, so I'll keep it short and just emphasize a few things where that I think the authors have some influence. In large part, you don't have any influence over the reviewers, but who you cite, this was mentioned, but who you cite are often candidates for reviewers. So, you know, you can use that somewhat strategically. I mean, you should cite the work you should cite for scientific reasons, but just keep that in mind. You are free to suggest reviewers at our journal. I think the chances that someone you suggest are selected is extremely low, but not zero. And we keep in mind that you suggested it. And you're welcome to suggest people that we should not consider, and you should give reasons for that. We do honor that, maybe with a very, very rare case where we don't, but we keep it in mind, even if we do ask someone to review something that you said you prefer not to, we keep in mind that you said not to. And we'd only do that if it was sort of viewed as like a preference you expressed and not a extreme conflict of interest or anything like that. Otherwise, it's just the same as you've already heard, so I don't need to say it again.
Great, thank you. Yeah, who you suggested to have and not have, very important. Alia, last up on the selection of reviewers.
I don't think I have really anything different to add, except to say that we also, like Kevin said, we have received quite a fair share of these letters that recommend reviewers, and it took us some time to catch up on what's happening. Although none of these papers went through, all of them were desk rejected, and I actually then sat down and audited certain kinds of papers going back 20 years, and all of them were desk rejected. And it's not, I don't think it's authors suggesting themselves. I think this is an organized, basically like a paper mill type thing where, you know, it's a company, I think, that manages these kinds of accounts. Most of the time, these are non-existent people. The interesting thing, I've Googled a little bit, and some of these names appear on the editorial boards of some journals in some third countries. So these dead souls actually have academic lives, at least kind of visibly so. And in a number of cases, these were real people whose email addresses were wrong, and we wrote to them, and they said, "Oh my God, I did not know that my name was used in conjunction with that." So we never accept, we don't ask authors to suggest reviewers, and we never accept their unsolicited suggestions. On a very rare occasion, I think in my experience of being an editor for 2 years, maybe one or twice we got a request not to use someone as a reviewer, and I think we honored that, although, you know, it really depends on how editors sort of view the cause, the reason that's been specified in the letter. But other than that, our editorial board members come on board with an expectation that they will review as well, so we draw on them. People that sort of you think of as potential reviewers and you ask and they say no, oftentimes provide suggestions of other people. And so that also kind of increases the pool of reviewers. I think that's all. I can't really think of anything else. But yeah, and Austin, right, your point about strategically citing in the paper, especially in the beginning, as a way to signal potential reviewers, I think is a good one too.
Great, thank you. And it looks like Kevin remembered his third point.
I did. One thing that does come up is a referee will say, "I've refereed this paper at another journal." And I think different editors have different policies about this. My policy is to say, you know, would you view your, mostly people say it when they were negative, right? My policy is to say, were your negative comments mostly about taste, by which I mean, you think this is not important enough, this isn't, you know, or do you have strong technical concerns about the paper? And if you have strong technical concerns about the paper, then I want to see you look at the paper, see if it's changed, see if you still have those concerns. If it's taste, well, okay, we should probably get somebody else, give this another shot.
Great, thank you. And Elizabeth thought of something else.
Sorry, just very quickly, I I think it's good for people to know that if you are turning around a paper, meaning you got rejected from a journal with feedback, not a desk reject, and I've heard many senior people advise you just send it right back out because this is all luck or whatever. Do not do that, because the precise thing that Kevin just described happens, right? People have reviewed it before, and if they see, and it's usually pretty clear that you didn't listen to anything they said, they're going to tell the editor, and it's just really, really not a good thing. So I personally think that's risky, but that's all.
Yes, absolutely. I agree with Elizabeth. Our worlds are very small, right? And think about the number of people who study what you study. If someone rejects it at journal A and then they see the exact same paper at B, they're going to be unhappy. So a rejection is basically just an opportunity to take the reviewers and make it better and go elsewhere. But yeah, definitely agree with that. I'm just going to add one point of information that might be helpful for folks who are new to the review process before we go to our final question and then our Q&A. Sometimes you will be sitting and waiting a long time for your decision to come along, and you curse the editor. It's not the editor sitting on the decision. It takes a very, very long time to get 2 to 3 reviewers. For most of us, we'll invite 6 to 8 reviewers with the hopes of getting 2 to 3 yeses. If your paper is on an idiosyncratic topic, or unfortunately, if it's of a part of the world that is not typically studied by the readers of this journal, you might have to go 12, 15, 18 reviewers. So that's another reason to suggest potential reviewers who are arm's length, with whom you do not have any kind of conflict of interest, because it does make our lives easier. And so if you're waiting a long time, that could be part of it. We're just waiting, right, to get a couple of yeses. So I don't know if folks realize just how difficult reviewer burden is for the profession today. And so we get lots of no's, and it's no reflection on the paper. It's just burden there. Yeah, really, really great advice on how those reviewers are chosen and how you can play some role in that process, depending on your discipline and journal. So in the interest of time, I think we'll wrap up with one final question for our 4 panelists, and then we will open the floor for Q&A. And if there are other topics that folks want to add, they can. So as editors, we're gatekeepers and we're being very stern here, but we all see multiple successes all the time of papers that start the process and end up beautifully and published, and they're widely cited. So what words of inspiration or encouragement can each of you give for authors? Kind of your one big piece of advice or encouragement as folks pursue this. And so I think we're back to the beginning of the alphabet. We'll do Elizabeth, Austin, Alia, Kevin.
Great. I think the most important thing to remember is that there is a home for almost everything. We may not get to follow up on everything that doesn't hit the first or second time that we send it out, but there is a place for your work, particularly if you listen to the feedback that you're getting. And it may not be the paper. Paper might be almost unrecognizable by the time you finish. That's true for, all of our work goes through multiple iterations, and it may not be in the place you imagined it going, but there's a future for the paper, and there's a home for the work, and it's just a question of how long it takes, and what you think of the process. We started out by talking about choosing a journal. And one thing I'd say for early career researchers is everybody wants a big hit early on. It feels like it's going to be the key to the job market and your reputation and your career. And I don't actually think that that is true. Obviously, it's great to get a big hit early on, but lots of people get big hits and flame out. And many of us built our careers incrementally, starting fairly modestly, getting our sea legs and learning the ropes, and then built up to a more advanced place. And I don't think you should feel too much pressure to get that big hit before you're really ready for it, or before you have a sense of how to publish. So there's a home for your work, and starting modestly does not mean you will finish modestly or stunt your career.
Good words of advice. Thank you. Next, Austin, your words of advice or encouragement.
Well, again, Elizabeth took some of the things I was going to say, so I agree. I guess I will add that it is a long slog. Sometimes you get let's admit it, somewhat lucky, and you get into the first journal you submitted to, not on the first try. That would be you're gonna have to revise. But to be rejected several times is normal. Don't feel like you are unusual. You know, don't let that imposter syndrome sneak in. Just put your nose to the grindstone, talk to your advisors, respond to the feedback, and just keep going, and you will find a place for that paper.
Great, thank you. Next, Alia.
I would say that no paper, even the one that only has one author, is a result of a sort of this individual genius work. It's always a collective work, in a sense that my advice is always to, before you send a paper out, to present it to multiple audiences, conferences, get people to read it, sometimes at different stages for different with different goals in mind. Obviously you want someone that, for example, if you're not a native speaker like myself, you may want to have someone read it at the very end before submission to make sure that all the articles, for example, are where they're supposed to be and all the other things. But earlier stages, you want to kind of test drive your, the big thing in sociology, your theoretical framing. Does it work? Is it sort of does it hook the reader? Is the introduction kind of as straightforward and interesting as it can be? So make sure you have an opportunity to share your work often and in different kind of fora, but also at some point you just need to send it off. You just need to let it go and send it off and see what happens. And when to send it off, I think it probably, if you're, if let's say if you're a graduate student, certainly your mentor, your advisor could be a good, could give you an advice on when the paper is ready to be sent. But it's always a risk, of course, and as Austin said, you have to know that rejections are common, happen to everyone, and it's not the reason to sort of stop or get upset, but just keep going.
Great, absolutely. Finally, Kevin, your words of wisdom.
Well, just two anecdotes, no wisdom. The first is when I was an assistant professor, one of my colleagues had a job market paper that I really thought was very good. And he submitted it many places, including places where I quite honestly felt, why would you bother? Nobody will ever read it if it's published there. And paper got better as it went along. And he was talking to a senior economist who was visiting, who said, I think you've been sending it to the wrong places. The editor at the American Economic Review would really like this paper. American Economic Review is clearly one of our very, very top journals. He sent it there, it was accepted. So, keep trying. There's a lot of randomness. Right, the advice from the beginning, finding the right match is important. I guess the other anecdote I would say is some of you will be aware that Claudia Golden won the Nobel Prize in Economics about a week ago. Fantastic prize, well deserved. I don't think there's anybody out there who disagrees with that. She had a very, very low publication rate for the first 7 or 8 years of her career. She did not get tenure at Princeton. She is clearly, as I said, there's no question she deserves the Nobel Prize. So, getting that fast start, as was suggested, is great, but it's not the be all and end all.
Absolutely. The papers you write as grad students and dissertators, it's the first thing you do, not the last, right? And view it that way. You have a whole life ahead to publish all these great ideas. So we have just about 15 minutes. And so this is our time to do Q&A. And so we'll have folks, you can either put it in the little box here, or you can just ask them out loud, which is more fun for us. So who would like to ask a question by either raising your cartoon hand or actual hand? And while we wait for the questions to come in, there were just a couple that came in on the Q&A box. One was, there was a question about what factors determine the number of papers that can be accepted each year. And I quickly typed an answer that all of our journals basically have page budgets that are given to us by the publisher or the association. And even if we have many, many more papers, we can make a petition to get more issues, but chances are you just have to fit them into the pages. But others might have different views of how do we figure out how many articles we can publish per year. Yep, Aya. Oh yeah.
I'm surprised to hear that the publisher gives you budget. We don't get, we are sort of in regular conversation with Oxford, and they don't give us a budget. In fact, we moved, well, I don't know, maybe your journal is published in paper still, because we moved online entirely a couple of years ago, 3 years ago, maybe. So I think it's tricky to increase the number of issues because the libraries, I think, are kind of subscribing based on the number of issues, but we have actually been alternating the number of papers we pad into an issue, because when we took over 2 years ago, we had a huge backlog, like 2-year worth of backlog of advanced papers that have not made it into the issue. And we sort of started to get rid of it when we came on board, increasing the number of articles per issue from like 9 to at some point 20 maybe. Now we realize, okay, so we want to keep, it's like how much of the income you want to keep for a rainy day. So we want to keep 2 issues worth on the advanced list. So now we kind of scale it down for this year from maybe down to 16, but we certainly don't have a budget, and we just basically publish the best papers we can publish. So Debbie, you're muted.
So we have Austin's hand up. Is that to answer the question about the pages? And then we have Jacob's hand up for a question.
Yeah, our journal doesn't have a page limit, but we do have a resource constraint, which is the number of editors, associate editors. And I like to keep the number of manuscripts they handle per year to a certain number, which means we're basically capped until our budget increases. They do get a stipend. Until our budget increases to have more stipends, we won't have more editors and we won't publish more papers.
Great, thank you. So we have a couple questions that just came in the box that we can get to in a moment. And Jacob, thank you for your posing a question.
Yeah, thank you very much for giving me that opportunity. And thank you for all the speakers for sharing your experiences from that perspective. So I'm a PhD candidate in anthropology, and I did publish an article 3 years ago. And the article, or the process of before it got published, it took about 4 years. So my question is going to be, how long do you suggest, or would you advise to leave a paper with one journal before you pull the rug, or before you suggest, withdrawing and looking elsewhere? And is that even possible? Is it something that you should, at this stage in my career or somebody else's career, is that even something that we should consider doing? Because I think each round of revision, there were 2, took more than a year on, for me to get back. I tried to do this very quickly as I could at the time. But yeah, in total, the process was, it was very long. I don't know if this is a normal experience. It might be completely normal, but thank you.
Thank you. To me, it sounds horrifying, but others, what happens if someone has a paper sitting under review? At what point do you just pull it? And I welcome any of you who wants to chime in on that.
Yeah, well, the normal length of time is going to vary by discipline. Economics is well known as being a very, very long time. My area, health services research, which borders on health economics, is faster, and our journal is the average time to final decision is 6 months. Average time to first decision is 2 months. There are some outliers, but getting to a year is quite a big outlier, and that just wouldn't happen. Would I advise withdrawing a paper? Well, I would have a serious discussion with the editor first. What is taking so long? First of all, it'd be good to know in advance. I mean, this is another criterion for choosing a journal. To the extent you could know it, but you can always ask the editor, what is your average time to final decision? If it's longer than you wish to wait, given your career stage, don't submit there. But then when you're reaching, some multiple of the average, maybe it's 1.2 or something, maybe you start to talk to the editor and say, what's going on? And that should give you some good information.
Great, thank you. Super helpful. Kevin's hand is up.
Yeah, I wouldn't hurry to withdraw it, but I think it's perfectly reasonable. Usually you can't get to the editor, but to get to the managing editor to say what's going on. In terms of, in our journal, I consider if it goes over 4 months for a first review, I consider that to be a failure. We do have a few. If it goes over 5 months, I'm really angry at whoever's handling it. And the one that went over 6 months got basically you're on probation as an editor if you don't clean up your act. In my own experience, I once wrote to somebody who knew the editor very well and say, I know the reports have been in, they've been in for a long time. Why isn't, should I just withdraw it? Is this because the person isn't getting the negative reviews that they want? And he said, can't be sure. And so we waited it out, and it went 4 rounds, which unfortunately is not unusual in economics, and took about 3 years. But it did eventually get published in one of the very top journals. So I wouldn't give up unless there's really some indication that they're just searching for a negative review, which occasionally happens. It shouldn't happen, but it does happen occasionally, unfortunately.
Great, thank you. Elizabeth.
Just very quickly to say, you have to figure out, go back and look and kind of get a sense of how long. Usually it takes a couple of weeks to get reviewers, and then reviewers have 6-8 weeks, somewhere between 4 and 8 weeks to finish. Reviewers are frequently very late, but do the calculations, not just on how long the reviewers are getting, but how long it takes to process the manuscript before an editor can send it out for review. And then, when it's a little bit beyond that, send a very tactful letter or email, to the editor inquiring with lots of, obviously it's almost certainly not, I think there are exceptions, but it's usually not the editor's fault. It's usually the reviewers, but politely keep after them, because people are just in the weeds, and you want your name to be one with positive, polite associations, but also not forgotten. So send those emails.
Yeah, great advice. Kind of advocating for yourself in the peer review process is important. You do it diplomatically, but you can still do it. And the editors probably feel really guilty, right? Let them know you have a tenure clock ticking, you're an assistant professor on the market, and they'll shake the trees to get the review, or they will reach out to a friend and call in a favor and get them to write a review if they're a content specialist. So feel empowered yet polite. Great. So yep. Okay. So here, great. People are chiming into the questions in the chat box. And while we look at that, other questions from folks in real time. Right. So I'll read some of the questions that just came in. Let's see. First time publishing. Would being a first-time publisher or a student have any bearing on the editorial decision?
Not really, no. Not on my journal.
Yeah, mine neither. Others, I mean, maybe, if the reviews are really harsh, but they think there's potential, maybe you'll give them a chance. But because it is, at least from the reviewer's perspective, for most journals, it's double blind. They don't know your age. It's not like an NIH first award or new investigator award. There tend not to be those bumps. But others, we had a couple no's. Editors, would you give a young new author kind of a boost in the peer review process?
on a close call, I might very well do that, especially if they're a young person who's coming out of a weaker PhD program where they may not have had the mentorship that they can get, that they could have got if they'd been at one of the top programs. I mean, on a few occasions, and I do want to emphasize it's not something I do with every young author. I've basically said, I see a paper here. You're a long way away from it. We're not going to go through the normal revise and resubmit process. You're going to send me your paper or your questions as you go along. I'm going to give you feedback. And when I think it's ready to go back to the reviewers, I will tell you to submit it and I will send it back to the reviewers. And where I will cut a break for a young person is, you know, somehow they don't quite follow the rules. You know, if a senior person says, you know, I didn't do a good job explaining what I did, you know, tough. You're senior. Don't appeal to me that you can answer the negative reports by just doing a better job of explaining what you did. I might, and I really want to emphasize, might give a break to a junior person and say, okay, you're still learning.
Great, Alia.
Yeah, I think I'm with Kevin. I think certain things, you know, you should. The reviewers don't know who the authors are, but we do. We know who authors are. We can look it up, for example, to contextualize sometimes when it's a close call. So I mean, I think if I'm managing, since I'm the chief editor, so I don't usually manage papers. So I don't write decision letters. It's the editors who write them. But sometimes I keep some papers for myself, a few, especially if they're right in my area. I would probably, if it's a younger person, I would take particular care in writing the decision letter. If I want to give them an R&R, I would give them much more guidance than what I would do, for example, for someone who I'm sure will kind of figure out how to navigate the reviews. But that being said, yeah, I mean, I think it can go either way, in a sense. Like, for example, when it's not a particularly strong R&R, you may have more faith in someone's ability to actually do it. But I think, yes, I take that into consideration. And on many occasions, actually, there's a thing called developmental review. It's sort of a review that actually, it's a review that could be developmental, but the editor also can take care in kind of guiding the person through the process, which may actually end up being a very long process with a lot of revisions. But I think the paper probably will be better as a result, and the person will learn something. And yes, I think I've done it in cases when I was managing papers for younger folks.
Great, thank you. And actually, I do that as well. If it's an R&R kind of on the fence, it'll give the younger person the break. So we'll have Elizabeth weigh in on that, and then we'll start wrapping up. Yeah.
I'll just say, and I hate to say this, but there's a big divide, and I personally will send things out for review that might not otherwise go out for review. If I see that somebody hasn't had opportunities for mentoring, our team does not really support that practice, so I'm going rogue with that. And reviewers don't like that and I get very angry emails from reviewers complaining about why did I send this to them, even though I have a very good reason. But I could not do any of the type of development editing or giving a boost to somebody. It would contradict the agreements we've made as a team. And I don't think in fact, I'm quite positive that none of our peer journals do that either. So that may be a disciplinary distinction.
Great. Coming back to the theme of huge heterogeneity. Well, we're just about at 5. And before we kind of thank our panelists and thank our audience members, do any of our panelists have any last thing that they've been wanting to say, but they forgot to say earlier? Or do any of our audience members have a question that they want to make sure they get at least one answer to before we adjourn today?
I might just say, like, there's a question about contacting the editor, and that we don't consult with people. I just want to quickly answer that. We don't consult with people. They have to either submit or not submit, but we don't kind of give advice ahead of time.
Yes, and we have a couple answers in that chat for folks who wanted to look in the Q&A. You know, my journal, the past two I've edited, if someone wants to send an abstract for fit, I'll take a look at it and only comment on fit, being really clear. It might not even go out for review because I can't gauge policy from this. But then we had two editors, Elizabeth and Austin, say their journal doesn't do that. And so this is a case, talk to your mentors, talk to folks you know who publish in the journal just to kind of get a sense. And the editor will tell you themselves that they don't do that. Any other parting thoughts or questions?
We weren't actually able to respond to the questions that were written. I just wanted to say the exception to multiple submissions that I know of is the law journals, where you are allowed to submit to multiple journals. I don't know if there are any people in law who are listening, and I'm wondering whether the book series version of the journals, people are thinking of journals like Psychological Science and the Public Interest, which is a 1 article per issue journal. And so those are like 100+ page articles. That's the only thing I could think of that might fit that description.
Oh, I didn't realize you couldn't answer the Q&A. I actually did think of one other thing that's worth saying about predatory journals. Right?
Yes.
There are good journals and there are journals that are duplicitous and you have to pay, and they're very strategic about giving their journal names that sound really realistic, rather than American Journal of Sociology to be the American Sociology Journal. And they will ask you for your paper because it sounded so interesting in the ASA program. It's a pay-to-play situation. They don't have impact factors. They're not respected. So if you're on the fence about where to send your paper, just check in with someone who has kind of more experience in the field, and they can help point you to a journal that's predatory. There are also lists of predatory journals you can find through Googling to differentiate those between the ones that will bolster your career. So that was the last thing I forgot to say. Any other tip of the tongue things that folks forgot to ask about?
I was shocked that there's a fee, and I just want to say we have an open access fee, but that's like to me that sounded predatory right away. So yeah, be very careful if it doesn't seem like the norm in the discipline, publishing somewhere where you're asked for money, unless it's open access, which is almost always a pretty hefty charge.
Great. So again, this is a huge process. If anybody has kind of lingering questions, kind of feel free to email a colleague, email me. If you're in a particular discipline, I'll try to find the answer from a person who is closest to your field. But before we all go have dinner, let's give a round of applause to our 4 editors today. Thank you so much for participating. Clap, 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 clap. And thank you for joining us. Please regularly check our website because we have other future professional development workshops coming up on project management. We'll do one on op-ed writing in December. We have usually about 1 a month on things that folks need to learn to make it in this crazy industry. So thank you so much for joining us today. And we look forward to seeing you all at a future event. Great. Bye.